editors of Spectre. My name's Ashley Smith. I'm the managing editor of Spectre. I'll be the MC. Well, I think that's a glorified term. I will try and moderate. That's an exaggerated term. I will try and control the editor's various comments and on all and sundry in the discussion tonight. First of all, I want to thank everybody for subscribing and donating to Spectre. Without the support that you've given us, there is absolutely no way we could have launched a print journal, let alone a website. So I just want to underscore how important your support is for the launching of the journal. And I think in many ways we picked the Dickensian moment to launch the journal. It's in ways the best time to launch a journal of revolutionary Marxist theory, because the world capitalist system amidst the pandemic and recession have so dramatically exposed the problems with the capitalist world system. And it's also shown the capacity of regular people to resist, that where we've seen in the US over 150 job actions and strikes in response to the horrific conditions that people have been thrust into. So in many ways, it's the best times to launch a Marxist journal. In many ways, it's the worst time to launch a Marxist journal, because of just the human suffering that we're seeing on a planetary level that people have been reduced to, and frankly, trying to raise funds for a Marxist journal amidst a global recession is a challenging thing that we've faced. But I want to underscore how successful we have been, precisely because people are hungry for revolutionary Marxism. So overall, we've raised nearly $65,000 to launch the journal. So we've been extremely successful, and we're still forging ahead to raise $75,000 for our project. So what we've got planned for tonight is a combination of the usual and the unusual, as you would expect from revolutionary Marxists. We wanted to begin with a discussion of the journal, and also talk about people's cultural survival tips for how to get by in a pandemic. And I was thinking about why this is such an important thing to combine. I was thinking about the Bread and Roses strike back in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912, that said their strike was about bread to sustain life, but about roses as well, for to celebrate all the beauty in life despite the horrors that we are living in. And we've really tried to combine that in the journal, both the serious Marxist analysis and content, but also incredible art. If people have seen the print edition of the journal, hopefully everybody has gotten their print edition. The art in the print edition is just spectacular, and we've tried to embody that in our new website that combines, I think, graphic and artistic flair with amazing revolutionary Marxist content. And in that spirit, I want to give a special shout out to Anne-Marie Nye and Gabe Berlin, who are our design team, who brought, I think, that roses dimension to our bread as Marxists. And I really want to thank them for all their hard work in the design end of the whole project. So let me just outline the agenda, and then we'll get going. We're going to have basically 5 different sections of the agenda tonight. The first one will be Kate Doyle-Griffiths talking with David McNally about the journal so far, our plans, and what we'd like to do. And then we're going to have moderated, semi-moderated, well, my attempt to moderate all the editors saying all the various things they have in mind for what the journal would do in the coming years. And then I think what will be another even less moderated event, and it's probably going to be an event actually, of everybody talking about everything from film noir to their favorite poems to the strange things they're watching on Stars and Hulu and their various thoughts about that. And I expect quite a ruckus, because the real debates come out when it emerges around culture. And then we're going to open it up to question and answer to all our subscribers and donors. And if you want to put questions at any time in the chat function on the Zoom call, I suspect many of you have been on endless Zoom calls, so you know about the chat function, but it's in the bottom of your screen. You just click on that chat function and you can type in questions, and Zach and I will field them and we'll send them back to the editors in the fourth part of the agenda. And then we'll conclude with Vanessa Wills and Zach Levinson giving comments on the future of the journal and our continuing drive for subscriptions and projection of the magazine and website. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Kate and David. Take it away, Kate, and all the editors should just introduce themselves.
So, hi, I'm Kate Doyle-Griffith. Actually, I think David is going to jump in first, and I'm going to follow up on him.
Okay, we'll do it that way. That's fine. First, let me just also follow up on Ashley and thank everybody who's not only taken the time out to listen to us this evening, but who has made the effort in incredibly difficult times to financially contribute to and support the Spectre project. It's no exaggeration, following up on Ashley, to say that at the best of times, it's a slightly mad undertaking to try to launch a print journal when print is dying as a medium. As much as we felt it was important to have a print presence, but then to do it at these times of financial insecurity and general social insecurity has really doubled the challenge. Yet I think it's fair to say that the journal emerged out of discussion among a lot of us who were, on the one hand, excited by the emergence of a new left in the United States and elsewhere, but also really concerned that two key elements needed to be part of the discussions and the conversations that are happening as this new left develops. The first being how we appropriate the best elements of classical Marxism and revolutionary socialism so that they're not lost to a new left. Those elements which have enduring value in our efforts to transform the world and to understand and interpret the world in order to do that. And secondly, a commitment to engaging with social reality and the ever-changing global working class as it is, which for us, as many of you will have gleaned, means that there's no analysis of contemporary capitalism and the global working class that isn't anti-racist, feminist, pro-queer, eco-socialist, and so on at its roots. And this idea that we wanted to create a space for the development of classical Marxism in relationship to all of the challenges of our world as it is today is, I think, been really at the heart of all of our conversations, and I hope you'll see that reflected in the first instance in the first issue of the journal. So as we proceed, we'll talk a little bit about our commitments in this regard and how we're thinking about developing them going forward and the like. I would also say to you that the ways in which we've tried to do that, you can see in, say, an article like the, to me, absolutely brilliant one by Vanessa Wills on the debate over Marxism and white privilege. Because what Vanessa does there is retrieve Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, but not in a purely recuperative fashion, but in a fashion designed to illuminate contemporary debates which have been roiling the left. And so it's thinking about the resources of classical Marxism as living ingredients of the debates and discussions that we're having now, which I think you'll see reflected in Vanessa's piece and I hope throughout the journal. The other thing I'll say before turning it over to Kate is that we've really been inspired by, in particular, the response that the webzine has gotten. And one of the reasons we decided to have elements of sort of cultural discussion here is because people who've responded to the webzine, in particular to the series that Tithi Bhattacharya is editing, on dispatches from the front line of care. People who've responded have demonstrated to us that there's a cultural explosion of writing and thinking and creating that's happening among frontline workers. Those of you who've looked at this series of dispatches on the Spectre Journal webzine that Tiffy has been central to editing will see that we've had hospital workers, we've had transit workers, we've had construction workers, we've had teachers, all producing amazing writing. There's a sense in which dealing with the realities of this crisis and this pandemic has really fired people to respond creatively, to write, to think, to engage in discussion. And I hope we can also convey a little bit of that in what we're going to do over the next little bit. So with those opening remarks, over to Kate.
Hi, y'all. Yeah, I just wanted to start a little bit, and of course, agree with everything that Ashley and David said about thanking people for really making this possible. I think it's going a lot better. It's going better than I could have really hoped. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the name Spectre, which obviously we chose that from the first line of the Communist Manifesto. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. And I wanted to just read a couple of the next few lines, because I think those are relevant too to what we're talking about today. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exercise the specter. Where is the party in opposition that has not been decried as communistic by its opponents in power? Where the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced parties, as well as against its reactionary adversaries? And so I just wanted, the spectre, right, is obviously the working class organized for itself against the ruling class. And, this is a debate that I think we're going to have in Spectre and amongst ourselves, all of us, as things move forward, in terms of, is this a moment where the working class is really beginning to get organized and fight back? And we don't know yet, but we do know that there's been 200 wildcat strikes in the U.S. over the last couple of weeks. So it's not a bad sign of haunting, right? And the point, right, of that being of Marx and Engels' propagandistic opening there being that when we aren't, we're not yet there yet, we're not yet organized, but all the same, those in power fear the working class in action against them. And that's what the name, at least to me, is meant to try to convey. And related to what David was saying, none of that really does happen actually, unless without this kind of cultural aspect of working class organization, working class life, and working class struggle as well. So that was part of our thinking and taking a little time to talk about things that are fun. I wanted to say one other thing about the fundraising aspect of things, or the support that we've gotten from all of you and from other people, which is not only have we almost reached our goal, although we're definitely going to need your help with that, and somebody will talk about that a little bit later. There was no big donors. There's no donation for Spectre that was over $2,000. I mean, so every cent of this is somebody here or somebody that's not here who put down a chunk of change, and we didn't have any grant funding or anything like that. So for me, that's one of the things I'm most proud of about this endeavor, and I think in terms of getting it launched and getting it started. And so I really do want to express my appreciation to all of you for that vote of confidence, and for that letting us be the kind of journal that we want to be. So we'll stop the boring shit and maybe start the interesting shit now. So thank you guys for being here. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks, Kate. Just one housekeeping thing. If people want to turn on there's different ways to look at the chat. If you put on speaker view, then you'll see a large version of the person who's actually speaking, and that's a little bit easier to follow than the Hollywood Squares version of the little images on your screen. So that's in the upper right hand corner. And also, if people have questions, there's already starting to be a great interactive dynamic on our chat function. If you have questions, feel free to write those in at any time. So now we're going to start our first round of conversations in with editors and on the board. And I'll call on them, and they'll probably get into a scrum of different ideas as we go into the discussions, which will be exciting and fun. So that'll go for about a half an hour. And then after a certain point, we'll turn our attention to the cultural survival tips. But the first bit is about the journal, plans, ideas, etc. And I'll first ask Tithi to jump in and share her thoughts.
Thanks, Ashley, and thanks everyone for tuning in. And thank you for tuning in while you're doing so much social reproduction labor out there. I can see children being fed. This is wonderful. This is exactly what Spectre needs to be. So my thoughts about when, we were trying to decide on what to say about what excites each of us about the journal. Obviously, it is the Marxist feminist heart of it that for someone like me was exciting. But then when I thought about it a little more, I think in the journal, what we are trying to do is not just be another feminist journal. I mean, there are some wonderful feminist journals out there, but to actually put gender as one of the explanatory dynamics of capitalism, right? So that is something that I hope Spectre will be able to do. So for instance, if we're talking about the economy, we have to talk about race and gender. If we're going to talk about art, we have to talk about race and gender. So putting social oppression in a relationship with economic exploitation is the sort of old chestnut that Marxism has yet to develop a theory for. We don't have a Marxist theory for social oppression as yet. So this journal is an exploration of some of those questions and some of those ideas. What is actually the relationship between oppression and exploitation? How does race and gender, sexuality, and so on actually vary across timelines as well as national locations? Why is it caste in India but race in America? What are these various dynamics? So what that does is actually makes the journal not just about women's issues or queer issues. It makes all articles in the journal address the dynamics of oppression. So that's our goal. Obviously, this is not something we're going to achieve in the first, few issues or the first year even, but this is what I see as our project theoretically to develop. If that's the theory part of the journal, then what we need in order to develop that theory is what actually Karl Marx tried to do in the 1880s, which is workers' inquiry. He believed that without getting the live voices of workers, which, as Lenin would say, I need to smell the vodka in the pages of Pravda, okay? So without the actual voices of working class lives and struggles, that kind of theoretical exercise is not barren, it is actually impossible. So you cannot have a theory completely abstracted from the lives and happenings of the working class world. So that's another project that I am hoping that Spectre will be able to do, to unite, because we're so fond of unitary theory, that we'll be able to unite, which is a sort of approach towards centering the voices of working class experience, and then using that experience to actually theorize about the world. And people theorizing should not be intellectuals who are paid in universities. That is another project of Spectre, that we want people writing for the journal who actually are the voices of these experiential moments. So we want workers in the journal writing and theorizing about capitalism and its brutalities. So those three things for me actually outline what I hope to see in the journal, what I will try to do in the journal, and I hope to be able to do it with all you guys' help.
Thanks so much, Tithi. That was Tithi Bhattacharya, who teaches at Purdue, and she's on the editorial board of Spectre. That's just an introduction. If all the other editors, because I think a lot of people know each other, but a lot of people don't. So I'm sorry to editorialize, Tithi. If you want to reintroduce yourself in a different way, that's totally fine. All right, Zach, you're up next.
Great. So thanks, Ashley. I wanted to say a couple things I think that are both similar to what David said and similar to what Tithi said, and then try to link them together. So I would say, from my perspective, the journal is really, really needed for two inseparable reasons. So first, we've all seen this kind of return of socialism and increasing popularity among a new generation over the past few years. But I think the meaning of the term itself has started to shift during this period. So, we can say, whereas it used to be firmly associated with mass movements and labor struggles, now we often see socialism used to describe policy prescriptions implemented from on high. And, to put the same point differently, I could say something like, if the socialist accent on inside-outside strategy used to be on the outside, it's increasingly today associated, I think, with the inside. So the key point I want to make, though, is without substantial pressure from the outside, the inside really becomes meaningless. So, first, I want to see this journal really bring the outside back into vogue, with the accent on labor struggles, on mass movements, on social struggles more generally. And second, I wanted to say that I think this slouch towards social democracy has been accompanied by the marginalization of what's recently been dismissed as fringe issues. So what we used to call anti-oppression struggles. So when we're talking about things like struggles around race or gender, sex, nationality, ability, or something else entirely, these are demands from sectors of the working class, who of course represent the majority of the working class. And so when we think of these things as fringe issues or marginal, what we're doing there is not taking the working class that we have, but imagining some working class in abstraction. And I think what's really important here is taking these struggles seriously, which is what we hope to do with this journal. We can't simply will some unified working class into being from above through this or that social policy, but we instead need to realize this general, we can say, by aiming at the particular. And so by this, I mean that all these various anti-oppression struggles, all these demands that are being put forward are actually working class demands. And I want to argue that it's only through anti-oppression struggles that we can work toward a kind of unity and difference, a kind of fighting collectivity that's finally capable of posing some kind of threat to capital. So that's my second point, that we desperately need some sort of venue for discussing anti-capitalist struggles, but as they actually occur on the ground, as Tithi was talking about in relation to workers' inquiry, we could say on the terrain of everyday life. But I think this is really, really important, trying to articulate these demands in relation to people's actually lived lives, as opposed to whatever abstract idiom we wish to see someday. So making it concrete, I think, is really, really important. And for me, these two go hand in hand. On the one hand, making these demands concrete, and on the other hand, this idea of retaining the meaning of social power in socialism, where socialism isn't something just legislated from on high, but something that's actually organized from below.
Thanks so much, Zach. Now we're getting into the meat of the matter, and people are starting to ask questions. So I encourage everybody to ask questions in the chat. Zach, if you want to keep track of those, because we've already got a couple that have come in, which would be awesome. I'll turn it over to Vanessa next. And remember to introduce yourself, Vanessa.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Vanessa Wills, and I'm very fortunate and happy and honored to be on part of the editorial collective at Spectre, and I'm also assistant professor of philosophy at George Washington University here in DC. And I mean, similar to my comrades here, the thing that I think, well, it's hard to say, but one of the things that I find most valuable about Spectre is the specific role that, that we are already playing, and that I think we can continue to play in arguing for the fact that there is no thinking about exploitation in the abstract capitalism. I mean, of course there is, and Marx did it, and we have to do that too. But when it comes down to really understanding struggles that are happening today and understanding how we can intervene in those struggles, understanding why the situation that we're in is such as it is, we have to look at the actual concrete way that capitalism is instantiated, right, as a system. And in its practice, when we talk about capitalism, we're talking about social relations between human beings, and those social relations are mediated by all sorts of categories, and some of those categories are categories of identity, like gender, like race, right? And one of the things that has been most frustrating to me over in my career, so my fellow philosophers can attest that philosophy in the academy, certainly in the States at least, is actually one of the most conservative of the humanitarian disciplines. So it's always an uphill battle, right, to talk about Marxism in those spaces. And then you add to that this kind of constant refrain, well, Marxism has nothing to add about race, or Marxism doesn't say anything about gender, Marxism doesn't say anything about queer issues. And what I find so frustrating about that complaint is that Marxism famously has been taken up by people of color and women and queer people and marginalized people of all sorts all over the world, right, since its inception. And so the only way that you can actually maintain the fiction that Marxists haven't done and aren't doing this theoretical work is to just sideline and edit out of the picture everyone who's not a white man, and even, as we know, lots of white male Marxists, right, think about these issues, right? So it's such a kind of it's a way of thinking about what Marxism has to contribute that already proceeds from perpetrating the very same erasure, right, that it claims to be concerned about. And it's very important to me to make that as difficult for people to do as possible, right, and to insist that actually Marxists are and have been deeply ingrained, right, in these kinds of struggles and the theory about them. And so, I guess that means that part of what brings me to Spectre is frustration and spite. But mostly, right, the fact that, I think I'm so happy to be part of a group that works to create a journal that puts all of these voices forward, that puts these struggles forward, and that does it in a way that, I don't know if it's because we all have a similar kind of political orientation in that way, that we care a lot about the interaction of exploitation and oppression, and thinking seriously about how those things play out. But it kind of happened very organically that I think the webzine and the print journal both just kind of like seamlessly foreground all kinds of different struggles, and does it in a way that always brings it back to thinking about, how is it that class is playing a role? And that's not to say that, that's not to sort of mechanically, abstractly, artificially say, well, we just care about class and we care, a little bit less about these other things, but sure, they're important too. No, right? But the thing that I think of Marxism as a production-based theory. It's a class-based theory when we're talking about a class society, right? But ultimately what Marx is concerned about is that the world we're in is one that we made, and it's one that we can make differently. And so that means that we have to think about our means of production, but we also have to think about all these other categories that mediate that. So to me, bringing together those questions of oppression and exploitation in a way that doesn't just leave them in abstract isolation, but thinks about how they all work together as parts of one system is, you know, for me, one of the most important contributions of Spectre.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. And up next, I would just want to interject that imagine if we didn't have a pandemic and we could all be in the same room like we had planned for the Historical Materialism Conference in Montreal and in the Socialism Conference. Imagine the richness of the discussion. So I'm sorry for the virtually alienated situation that we're in, but someday we'll be back in a room together and we can talk and debate and discuss. So in that light, I'll turn it over to Charlie, who I know loves unitary theory.
Okay. Hi. Charlie Post. I've been on the socialist left for a while. I make a living teaching sociology in New York. I'm active in my faculty union, and I'm very happy to be part of this project. And one of the things that drew me to it, and I think this is echoing things that David and the other editors have said, is that, and I think it's also begins to relate to the question that Paul LeBlanc raised in the chat box, is that this journal sees itself as a place where the new socialist left can engage in serious theoretical and strategic and analytical discussions. It's where people, I'm hoping it becomes one of those places where the most serious activists and serious militants in this new socialist movement that we're seeing emerge, among people who are actively organizing resistance to capital, will come to look for serious and open debate around a whole series of questions that confront us in our everyday political practice. I think there's been, to be honest, many of the venues that we had all hoped would be a venue for those sorts of debates and discussions have over the last few years tended to narrow, and where the voices, only certain voices are presented and others are excluded. And I hope that that Spectre becomes one of those places where really serious discussion and debate among people who have short disagreements can be had. And for me, there's three questions that I really am very concerned that we take up and address. And one, and this builds on what everybody else has been saying, is to develop a theoretical and historical account of racism that roots racism in the way in which capitalism constantly reproduces itself and constantly, by its dull compulsions, constantly divides working people along a whole variety of lines, but particularly for me, the one that has been least adequately theorized has been race. We are beginning to have that discussion. We're beginning, after a 30, 40-year hiatus, to have a serious work on providing a unitary theory of capitalism and gender through the work of comrades who've been working around social reproduction. We need to begin that project as well on race. And Vanessa's essay in the first issue is a very good start, and we need to continue that. There's two other questions I think we need to be grappling with very seriously. And one is socialist political strategy. And there's two sub-questions. One is the question of whether or not the working class can use parts of the existing state to advance the struggle either for immediate reforms. Can we win things by electing good people, serving on boards, etc.? And whether the existing state can be used to transform the existing society into socialism. I think that those debates have been begun to reemerge as a new socialist movement has reemerged. And this is very closely related for me to having a really serious, open, comradely, but sharp discussion on how socialists relate to electoral politics. How do we actually understand concretely and historically the relationship between mass, confrontational, social movements, worker struggles, etc., and electoral politics? And finally, we need to continue to sort of grapple with, and I hope we can get a variety of voices on this, how capitalism has been transformed and not been transformed over the last 40 odd years? To what extent has what we all call neoliberalism actually transformed the terrain of class struggle in the US and other parts of the global north and around the world? So those are the questions I'm hoping, along with all the other questions other comrade editors raised, that we're going to be grappling with. And I hope that many of you could not only continue to help us materially engage these questions by subscribing and supporting us, etc., but also contribute to the debates and discussions in the journal over the coming years.
Thanks so much, Charlie. I did want to just say one of our board members, Cinzia Russa, can't be on the call tonight because she's in the middle of class struggle at the New School for Social Research, where they're facing massive attacks, like many people in higher education, and who are both professors, staff, and building and grounds as we go through this incredible crisis. Just to remind people, to send and put any questions you have in the chat. And we've got Holly, David, and then Kate, and then I'll give a little chance for people to respond to one another before we move on to the cultural survival bit. So next we've got Holly. Take it away, Holly.
Okay, hi everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm so sorry I was having technical difficulties, but hello everybody. I'm really happy to be here. So what excites me about Spectre as a journal is that it's committed to, serious analyses of, to me, what is neglected and new terrain. So like Charlie was just saying, neglected terrain for me is, I was also really impressed by the careful philosophical intervention on Vanessa Will's piece on Marxism and the idea of white privilege, and also, how the journal is taking up Marxist social reproduction theory, and how analyses of capitalism literally engender our lives. And I'm calling this neglected because we debate this stuff all of the time, but I feel that we often debate it from kind of prefabricated polemical positions. And I'm just seeing a lot of nuance in what's coming out of the journal, and I'm happy with the nuance that's being put forward. And by nuance, I don't mean kind of sort of nonsense or explaining away, but really giving us grounds for a capacity to move forward in a way that is helpful with on the ground struggle, and I love that. And where I might differ from some of some of the editors is that well, not really, probably, but I'm also really hoping that we can apply a classical Marxist analysis to new terrain. And what I mean by that are some of the debates about network capitalism, exchange value of data, what Richard Seymour's been calling the social industry. And the reason why I say that I can't wait for us to take up those questions is because, whenever something historically new happens, or whenever there's some kind of technological innovation, I feel like academics always say, oh, well, Marx is over, or Marx can't explain this because, he wasn't around for the development of X, Y, or Z, so he can't possibly have anything to say about it. But, if there's a market for it, it can be understood through a Marxist framework. And I know that the journal is going to be, foreground that. And lastly, the dispatches of the front lines of care and the kind of labor analyses that are coming out. And I think that we desperately need a vehicle for international communication between working people if we want to move past the horizon of social democratic politics. And I think that I see that in Spectre's future. So that's pretty much it.
Thanks so much, Holly. And now to round out the relatively organized bit of this, we'll have David and then Kate for their repeat performance from earlier. So David, take it away.
Okay, well, we really didn't script any of this, but I have to riff off Vanessa's point about production, because for me, that's also, I think, central to the way in which we envision the journal. That is to say that We want to be part of an active process of producing theoretical analysis that is informative for the left as it is emerging and developing. And it reminded me, listening to Vanessa, during the debates over art and culture in the 1930s, when basically anyone in the communist type left who wasn't producing Moscow-style social realism was being denounced. Bertolt Brecht commented on the Russian CP leadership of the movement and their attempts to dictate cultural policy. And he said, they are enemies of production. And what he meant by that was, we need to experiment, we need to innovate, we need to develop. We cannot just simply repeat the cultural and artistic forms. And I think that really describes every era in which revolutionary Marxism undergoes a great renewal and renaissance, whether it's as early as Marx in 1857 getting taken by the fact that there's an economic crisis and stays up all night for months on end writing his Grundrisse notebooks, where he essentially conceives the project of capital. Or whether it's the crisis in the run-up to end of the First World War, where a whole new wave of Marxist theorizations of imperialism emerged. Whether it's the recovery of the dialectical traditions of Marxism during the wave of European revolutions that happens after 1917. When we move to the era of the 1960s and 70s, and all of a sudden we have the emergence of new, brilliant anti-colonial Marxisms, of feminist, anti-racist, and increasingly as well, historical materialist work that we now recognize as queer Marxism. And we're at another one of those moments. I mean, this is a profound moment of crisis and potential renewal for the Marxist left. And I think, if anything, the commitment that we want to make with Spectre is, we're going to try to stay away from lazy repetition. That's out there. You probably don't need it. We probably wouldn't do a very good job of recruiting any of you to support our project. We think that it really is a moment where there can be an enormous re-energizing of revolutionary Marxism or classical Marxism that is all about, of course, building on the best resources that we've inherited, but extending it to grapple with a whole new set of problems, to produce new kinds of analysis that are needed for this moment, going back to the kinds of questions that Holly was just throwing out about different forms of capitalism, different sectors and industries, but also, as I say, of course, also of the changing working class, its everyday life experiences, and its modalities of resistance.
Thanks so much, David. Kate, you'll end the more formal thing, and then I'll just ask people to respond to one another on the board if they haven't had a chance to. So, Kate?
Yeah, so, I mean, a lot of people have said a lot of different things, but all of which I agree with. But what I want to expand upon a little bit is draw on some of the ideas here about, unitary theory, some of the ideas about taking seriously a kind of Marxist analysis of oppression, but not as individual kind of categorized subjects, or really as sort of side points to working class politics, right? But as actually constitutive of working class politics and constitutive of the working class, which I think is what we're saying here. And to go back to what I was talking about, even in that little part in the Communist Manifesto, right, which is not the deepest Marxist theory out there, where he's talking about sort of communism, we know that it exists, right, in part because of opposition to it, right, and that it's really it's that dynamic, right, and that sort of dialectic, right, is something that we do see repeated in all those moments that David was talking about of kind of cultural flourishing, when space is opening up for working class politics, for working class cultural production and working class culture, right, to really kind of develop in opposition to capitalism. And so, to contrast that, right, with a certain kind of socialist politics that emphasizes unity of the working class on the basis of the kind of lowest common denominator, single issue class analysis that sees opposition to racism, or not even just opposition, but kind of assertion of, say, queer identity or trans identity or pro-Black identity in politics as being divisive of working class politics, really runs counter to the Marxist tradition, and I think runs counter to the future of socialism, communism, the planet, whatever we want to put that. And so you'll see this a lot, I think, where people talk about, for example, reclamation of slurs or identities assigned, right, by oppressive institutions as being postmodern and therefore not Marxist, or as being divisive or confusing or something that working class people aren't able to understand. I do think, I think that's completely the opposite of what the case is. That in fact, that kind of reclamation defines Marxist politics. It's right there at the beginning of the Communist Manifesto, right? They're calling us communists, so we're communists. They're calling us queers, so we're queers. And we've seen this happen in sort of really the most advanced sections of working class politics at every kind of moment of history where our project has developed and started to take power. So that's really what I was thinking about when I was thinking about Spectre, right? And what we mean when we're talking about Spectre, and what we're trying to draw out precisely through, as Vanessa was saying, kind of a more organic process. And just to give you an example of that, some of the things for the webzine that we've recruited, are things that somebody shared their art in an organizing meeting, art about working as a bartender. And that's something that I think would be perfect on Spectre, right? That would complement exactly the kind of dispatches and workers' inquiry that Tithi was talking about. Workers are doing their own inquiries all the time. And one of the jobs of socialists, who are also workers all too, right, is to kind of bring those perspectives together, right, in a way that they inform each other, in a way that they help develop the theoretical layer of what we're talking about, right? That theoretical layer is not like born out of our brains as brilliant Marxist professors, even though some of you are my friends and also brilliant Marxist professors, right? It's really born out of being able to bring together these kind of different perspectives, sometimes that are in opposition in a capitalist context, right? Capitalism, of course, throws people in opposition precisely along the lines of race, gender, class, sexuality, and all those things. It's our job to help move through that opposition rather than to try to kind of squash it or to push back, right, against the self-assertion of working class people in the way that they find themselves existing in the world, and turning that kind of disempowerment into a form of empowerment and organization. So whether you want to call that communism, whether you want to call that queer politics, or whatever you want to call it, that's what I'm really interested in. And that's where I'm always looking to see what Spectre can do to kind of help bring that together, pull that together. And I think all of you here are part of that project as well. That's not a task that any one of us can do alone. So I'll try to just leave it there, because I think we've been blabbing on for a while and I want to hear what people have to say about, I don't know, television, because I think it will be related, but also maybe a little less dry. So thanks again, everybody, for listening to us.
Great. I guess people are eager to get to the culture. I was going to give a little chance if anybody on the board wanted to respond to each other, but following what Kate just said, I think we can move on to the spectral discussion of Marxist survival strategies amidst the pandemic. And one thing I did want to disabuse people of, I had heard from some people that we were referring to James Bond when we named the journal Spectre. And I just want to say that that's completely false. It's exactly what Kate said, that it's right out of the Communist Manifesto. And anyway, we like our Marxism shaken, not stirred. So with that, I will let Tiffy.
Wait, Ashley, can I say one thing about that to just kick
Sure.
off our cultural
Yeah, yeah.
debate? Which is, you know, James Bond is the imagination of the ruling class about threats to it, right? Or about assertions against it. So I see the fact that that Spectre, the role that it plays in James Bond is this like dangerous, secret international conspiracy as precisely the ruling class kind of nightmare about what it's up against, and then attempting to appropriate that. And, you know, so I disagree with you. I think we're exactly James Bond Spectre. That's what they're thinking we are. You know, whatever, reclaim it. Fuck that.
And it's begun. The scrum has begun. So Kate and I are now into it over Spectre. But I know Tithi wanted to get in. So Tithi, why don't you launch our discussion of the cultural survival strategies?
Oh no, first thank you. I wanted to, however, take a second to respond to Paul LeBlanc. First, to thank him for asking the most difficult question as the first question of this editorial collective. Are we going to launch a party? So, you know, something that is $1 million question on every left agenda point he asks as the first question. So thanks, Paul. I wanted to say very briefly on that. I never saw Spectre as the journal that's going to recompose the left. In fact, I'm actually opposed to notions of the journal. We hope that Spectre will be part of a left ecology of journalism. But within that left ecology, I hope Spectre will play a particular role in helping develop the new socialist left, as Charlie said, but also to grow a new socialist left. Because, you know, somebody said, I can't remember who, that older questions are coming back. And those of you who are organizers on this call, how many meetings have you gone to in your, you know, early 30s, and for us in our late 40s, where you think, oh my God, I can't believe these 18-year-olds are asking that question again. I thought we had resolved that. So all of you have been through that, which means every era of capitalist recomposition throws up certain old questions, but also certain new questions, because capital finds ways of exploiting labor through various social oppressions in new ways, because it has to, because the working class learns how to fight in particular ways. So the capital has to develop new strategies. So each period, we find ourselves facing some old questions, but also facing some new ones. So, I mean, I want to draw people's attention to one factor which I think I see as vital to the Marxist tradition, and that Spectre will embody, which is Marxism is actually a living tradition. So for instance, Marx did not have a theory of the capitalist state till 1871, which was the Paris Commune, in where he looked at a worker state, you know, happening and decided to write about it. Marx, there wasn't a developed theory of imperialism till the First World War. So Marxism as a living tradition has always faced the challenges that capital has thrown at it and developed new theories in order to meet that challenge. And I know our period is going to throw up the kind of challenges that Charlie's talked about and Holly has talked about. And I hope Spectre will provide that venue for open discussions amongst leftists without any danger of heresy hunting on our pages. Okay, and so that is something which I hope, as Paul's question indicates, will actually help towards building a new left, but also towards training it. So I just wanted to add that to the discussion from previously. Okay, cultural survival.
Yeah, Tithi, what people really want to hear about is what you think about Shakespeare's Tempest, Caliban, and what your daughter is writing.
Oh, dear gosh. Okay, so no, when you say cultural survival, Ashley, the way to survive this pandemic is to have someone clean your house, cook for you, and do childcare for you, which none of us do, and only Boris Johnson does. So that's why we are reading various things and watching TV shows to help us cope with this unprecedented condition of being cooped up with our loved ones. Okay, and I say that with ultimate love. So Shakespeare. So my daughter and I are rereading lots of Shakespeare, for her the first time. And when you read Shakespeare, as I've been doing for a while, every time you reread a play, you notice new things about it, right? So it's like when you read any classical literature. So this time around, I noticed the kind of things that one wouldn't notice if one weren't in lockdown. So for instance, one of the things that Lear says to his second daughter, which is Regan, is he berates her as a plague sore or embossed carbuncle in my corrupted blood. Okay, if that is not a reference to like plague boils, I don't know what is. Okay, so there is no reason why I would notice that if I wasn't reading it in lockdown. The second thing is, did you know why Romeo and Juliet died? This is a very sad fact I have to reveal to all of you. It is not because of the bloody discussion between the bloody vengeful war between the two families. It is because a monk failed to get the important message about where Juliet was going to be because he was under lockdown. So he couldn't go to Romeo and deliver that message. He was under lockdown. So the letter never got delivered. Romeo never learned that Juliet was not dead, and so on. So these are amazing, weird stuff that I am noticing about Shakespeare as I reread him again. But of course, to go back to something that Vanessa said, Shakespeare is usually shown to be like the ultra classicist dead white man, right? And there is. I mean, there is no way you can read Tempest and like Prospero, or maybe you can. I can't. I mean, Prospero is an absolute dick. So, but he has the most amazing lines in theatrical history being spoken by Caliban, who is the colonized, right? It is where he says to Prospero, you took my island, which was my mother's. Hello, there is a matrilineal tradition there. You took my mom's island, you made me a slave, and then amazing, he says, you made me teach you where all the resources of this island are, okay? So this is just colonialism being woven out for us by Shakespeare at the very time when England was actually discovering the rest of us, which is the colonized world, right? So this is an amazing fact that I noticed about Shakespeare. And of course, I like Shakespeare because of all the sex. I mean, you cannot get by without like a penis joke or a bottom reference. So, you know, the bod in me absolutely adores it. And so if you want to pair your Shakespeare, pair it with some nice alcohol, and then Sex Education is the show that goes with a perfect reading of Shakespeare. It is cringeworthy, teenage sex, but extremely queer friendly and feminist, just like Shakespeare.
Thanks, Tiffy. And in that vein, we've got Zach, who's going to talk about Lord of the Rings in Africa and Tronte discussion groups, The Americans, Westworld, and Mrs. America.
I'll try to cover all of these things. Yeah, so I think my first response when I found that I would be at home for months and months was to really read what I wanted to read for the first time in as long as I can remember, and at a leisurely pace. And so I think first I read a couple of things. I read this really, really good novel by Marlon James called Black Leopard, Red Wolf. That's sort of this is the Lord of the Rings reference, but it's this kind of like surrealist Lord of the Rings set in Africa, probably in some ancient period, unclear. But it's one of those novels where at the very beginning they have a whole list of characters that sort of, if anybody's read any of the Elena Ferrante novels, like at the beginning, when you keep flipping back to the beginning, trying to keep track of who's who. And I felt like my my great aunt Yetta, after we came out of the Lord of the Rings movie, and she turned to me and she said, and I asked her, like, so what do you think of the movie, Aunt Yetta? And she said, too many goblins. And so, it was a great novel. It's hard to keep track of all the characters, but that I read a really good memoir that came out recently by Nina Aaron that's about, what was it called? Good Morning, Destroyer of Men's Souls. That it's kind of like it's a memoir not about addiction, but about codependency. And so the premise of the book is that there are God knows how many memoirs about addiction, but very few on codependency, let alone from a feminist point of view. And so it's really interesting that she actually doesn't talk at all, of course, about social reproduction theory, but there is a way that her analysis of what codependency entails articulates very nicely with social reproduction theory. So this is a book by Nina Aaron. Otherwise, to be honest, I keep finding myself in these damn Zoom reading groups, meaning I'm on Zoom all day, but I think some of it is just being starved for sociality. And, every once in a while I'll see a neighbor and when I'm on my daily walk and we talk from like, God knows how many feet away. But yeah, I feel like I've had this terrible FOMO, this fear of missing out when it comes to anytime I hear of a reading group, I try to get in. And so now I'm in so many that it just feels like, it feels like that's what I spend all my time doing. And then I've been watching quite a few things. So I've been trying to catch up on, if anybody's seen The Americans, I never saw it when it was on. And so now I've made it through season 4 so far, the show about Soviet spies in the US. I watched this, or I've been watching, it's not done, but this show Mrs. America, that's a kind of, I don't know if you can call a show a biopic, but kind of biopic about Phyllis Schlafly. It's quite good so far. It's a little bizarre. The way it represents the American feminist movement, I think, is a little bizarre, with Betty Friedan as the extreme leftist. That I find myself, if people have seen the show Westworld, I find myself unable to stop watching it, even though I've despised it since the beginning. I just find it incredibly boring, but I also feel like I've sunk in so many hours that I just can't stop. So I guess that's what I've largely been doing.
Great. Thanks, Zach. I do want to hear what the Marxist position is on the great comedy Schitt's Creek. So if anybody wants to chime in on that, I'd be happy to hear about it. We got Vanessa on guitar playing and watching travel shows.
Okay, yeah. So we've been talking a lot about the title of our journal, Spectre, and Kate talked about that line from the Communist Manifesto. And I just wanted to reference that in this conversation about culture and art and how these things help us. I mean, it's striking that Marx, the originator of the materialist conception of history, right, writing, trying to initiate a shift in theory to move German thought and international thought away from, 100 years of German idealism, right, and Hegel, right, as much as he's taking over and inheriting from Hegel, not the idealism, certainly. He wants to leave that behind. He's doing everything he can to upend that. And in the Communist Manifesto, which is this kind of important nodal point in Marx's development as a theorist, and he's putting forward, this is an agitational document, and it's striking that he opens it with a specter is haunting Europe, right? The specter, what is more ideal, abstract, psychological, right? That's Geist, like if anything is, right? It's spirit. And so, we have to ask, well, why is he doing this? That's obviously an intentional choice and a really surprising and kind of strange one. And I think that it's because he's also, as much as he's reacting to this tradition of idealism, he's also reacting against this tradition of very simple, kind of crude materialism that doesn't have a way of accommodating metaphysically, right, on a philosophical theoretical level, has no way of accommodating the role of human thought, creativity, agency, spirit, right? Spirit is materially grounded. We have to eat. That's why we do social reproduction theory, and even better, social reproduction. right? But this is all of these things come together, and so I think that's again, that's where we're at in this moment. That's why it's important that our journal is called Spectre, right? And because that's what differentiates Marx from the different kind of strands that he's interacting with. Um, so on that note, right, this is a time when art is extremely important. um, I am probably one of the things that's most helpful for me is that a number of the musicians that I like to listen to, who tend to be independent artists, singer-songwriters, right, acoustic singer-songwriters, folks that travel, these are real like working musicians who are traveling all the time and playing to 50 or 100 people in a room, if that, right? And it's a big blow for them not to be working. But a number of the folks that I love to listen to that fall into that category have just kind of seamlessly transitioned into online performances. So one of my favorites every night at, and he'll start in a couple minutes here. Don't worry, I'm here with you. but every night at 7:30, he puts on a show, right? And so, and I've been finding new artists that way. I just found out that the Philadelphia Folk Festival is going to be held online virtually this year. And that I'm really excited about that. Music is, when people ask me what my hobbies are, I can give two answers. One is music, or I can say, oh, well, I love to sing, I love to play guitar, I love to go to shows, I love to listen to music, I love to talk about music. I can like give you 13 different ways of saying music. That's my hobby. So, I've been turning to that, and also, very glad that we live in this modern era where that doesn't have to be a solitary activity just because I'm in confinement. It can, you can still have the sociality and the kind of magic, right, and luster of live performance even. So I'm very happy about that, and I've also been spending more time with my guitar, and playing. I aspire to be a competent guitar player. That's all I aspire to. I have other interests. Right? I know like what the time is that I have to devote to this, and competency I think is a reasonable goal. So that's what I work towards. And I've signed up for a songwriting class, a beginner songwriting class, being offered by a small venue that I hope survives, right, this whole thing. And so I got an email from them and decided to start. And I'm loving that. One of the things that I'm enjoying about it is, especially as a professor, I love being taught. I don't know if my fellow professors there's nothing I love better than like being taught, like being in the classroom and letting somebody else worry about like the syllabus and all that stuff. And the woman who teaches this class is very young. She's about 21 or 22, so about half my age. And I love learning from younger people. I think it's awesome. I think it's good for the soul. I think it's very exciting. So, things like that, and it's a class, so I'm meeting with other people. And I'll just say lastly, to kind of bring this full circle, one of the things that I enjoy about that, I do a lot of, as you might guess, philosophical writing, political writing, very analytic writing. And my aim is always to be very clear and very precise and very kind of rigorous and deliberate. And, it's a transition to try to do more artistic, kind of, evocative, kind of abstract kinds of writing. And so I'm really enjoying this time to get in touch with that kind of artistic and creative side, because the two things feed each other. I mean, most people on this call probably know, I mean, Marx as a youth wrote all sorts of poetry, mostly really terrible. But what's so magical about that is when you go and you read his other, you know, works, when you read Capital, like these works that are extremely analytical and scientific and all this stuff, he writes as a poet. He writes as a poet the whole time. He never stops. He's one of the most beautiful poetic authors, you know, that has ever walked the planet. You know, and so, you know, I think that he gives us an example of bringing those two things together. As Ashley said earlier, bread and roses, you know, we need them both in order to make a human life, right? Not just our biological existences are the necessary circumstance for our lives as creative human beings. That things go hand in hand.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. I did want to call people's attention. Anthony Arno put in the chat that the National Theater and the Globe are both doing live performances and rebroadcasts of performances of various Shakespeare plays. So if you get the chance to watch them, they're quite incredible. Now we got Charlie Post, who you get to ask all the questions you were afraid to ask from him about Scandinavian noir.
Okay. Yeah. One of the way comrades on the board know that I'm probably the person who has the least developed literary taste among probably the entire group. And I tend to really enjoy reading and watching mysteries. They've always been, for me, quite fascinating. It's probably why I became a social scientist. I like figuring shit out, etc. I also think that various mystery genres give some interesting insights. And I think for me, going back and watching, there's a lot of good on Netflix, Amazon, etc., Scandinavian noir, sort of dark mysteries. I've watched The Bridge, which was this Norwegian, Swedish production, Trapped, which was an Icelandic production. And I think what really appeals to me is that, particularly in this period when a lot of the left is basically saying, if we were only in Scandinavia, if we only had a social democratic welfare state, everything would be fine. And what's interesting is that much of Scandinavian noir is actually a critique of social democracy. The three most important figures in Swedish noir in particular, Sajval and Walu, who wrote the Martin Beck novels, Henning Menkel, who wrote the Kurt Wallander novels, and Stieg Larsson, who wrote the Millennium novels, Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, etc. All of them were shaped politically by organizations to the left of social democracy. Sajval and Walu were members of the Swedish Communist Party. Menkel was some sort of Maoist, and Larsson was a Trotskyist. And what all of these novels and the TV shows that are based on them, etc., tend to bring out is that there's an very ugly underbelly to the capitalism of the human face that Scandinavian social democracy is supposed to give us. That underneath the welfare state and everybody and clean streets, etc., is really nasty anti-immigrant racism, human trafficking, homophobic violence, incredible poverty, drug and alcohol abuse, capitalist corruption of politics, surveillance, repression, etc. And so for me, that's one of the things that just brings me back to that. Along with, of course, trying to go through again for the fourth or fifth time, The Sopranos, which is, as many of us feel, is a really good commentary on American capitalism in the late 20th century. And actually, when Zach mentioned The Americans, that was one of my favorite shows because I really think that the two main characters give a very interesting take on how late Soviet citizens looked at their own system. That Carrie Russell's character tends to be completely disgusted with American consumptionism and how decadent and bourgeois it is, whereas her partner is completely amazed that things work, like air conditioning and cars, etc. So that's what I've been doing, along with a lot of cooking and enjoying the fact that I have adult children who no longer live with me. Thanks.
Thanks, Charlie. Kate put in the chat, I don't know if it's a myth or true that both of you are having a birthday and you're going to be 39 on Friday. So,
Kate may be 39. I'm going to be a bit older, for better or worse.
Part of it was true. I was just trying to mess with you.
Holly?
I'm up, huh?
Yeah, you're up.
Yeah. So, I'm going to start off a little bit actually depressing, but then I think that I'm going to end on a really positive note. So just bear with me through the kind of the down part of what I'm about to say. So, I think that this has been hard for all of us. One of the difficulties that I've had is having students that have been sick with COVID and whose family members have been in the hospital, and having to do that social reproductive task that's often put on faculty members at working class universities of having to help people to figure out, like, how are they going to get online, so it's been really stressful. And the way that I deal with stress is not to be, I actually don't, unlike Zach, I can't actually pay attention to reading through a novel. And so one of the things that I do is, I engage in full-on Freudian repetition compulsion, and I seek out everything that has to do with whatever is traumatic in my world. So, when I'm stressed out, I will play the game Plague Incorporated, and I'll play from the perspective of a virus. Or I watch pandemic-related television, like, Contagion or the show Pandemic, right? And there's something about this, the catharsis of it's really soothing. My partner's the opposite. Like, my partner wants to go and like watch comedy, and it doesn't distract me, and then I get really stressed out from the very fact of trying to not think about it. So one of the things that I do is I kind of stay in it, right? But here's the positive thing. What I do to get out of it, and what this affords me to be able to do, is to engage in forms of creativity. And I'm also an editor at a little magazine / newspaper called Locust, and that is it's a revolutionary arts newspaper for working class people. It's an outlet for working class creativity, and it's an outlet that challenges what Mark Fisher called capitalist realism. So people submit either art or fiction, or in some cases poetry, that instead of trying to capture exactly the moment that we're going through in the way that, say, Soviet realism did, the idea is that what we're going through is so over the top that the best way to cope with it is to go through really kind of like a pure creativity, a revisiting of surrealism, a revisiting of magical realism. But in those cases, both of those traditions have been recuperated by capitalism, right? I mean, surrealism very explicitly. I mean, in 1969 there was a parade for the death of surrealism. In terms of magical realism, like if you talk to literary agents, it's now a genre, right? It had this kind of roots in Latin American radical culture, and it's kind of moved towards like just, I don't know, pure quirkiness or whatever. So what we're trying to do is create something that we call critical realism. So it's critical, where being imaginative isn't pure fantasy, but being imaginative has this critical capacity. And one of the things that I enjoy is that, so instead of kind of watching, I'm being involved in this creative process. And instead of watching something, I'm reading what comrades are writing and what they're envisioning. So there's this kind of intimacy that happens with it. I can see how other people are mentally escaping through quarantine, or I can mentally escape through quarantine through kind of connecting with other people's imaginations. And I find that incredibly, incredibly hopeful. And I think that this for me, this idea, I mean, like Charlie was saying about noir. I mean, when I think of say what's on Netflix, right? Like what we're watching is incredibly capital intensive, entertainment processes. And so I think that when I was younger, I was kind of looking for anti-capitalist sentiment, right? A storyline or characters that reflected that. And I do agree with this idea that the kind of the vision of anti-capitalism portrayed through these kind of capital intensive modes of entertainment are, they don't really, I mean, of course they don't really lead anywhere. They kind of become a stand-in for actually engaging, like you're watching Avatar and, okay, well, we're fighting the corporation, and I think that maybe Zach, maybe that's why Westworld is so boring to you. I mean, it's just that storyline once again, right? Here are the workers on our TV or whatever, the symbols for that are fighting that, right? So what I've been working with other comrades on is how do we engage one another through the materials that we have at hand, so we can share and kind of have like a bottom-up vision of what creativity and intellectual and imaginative survival, what that looks like. So that's what I've been doing.
Awesome. Thanks, Holly. We have David and then Kate. I think this is a tag team operation from what I've heard, but David and Kate, why don't you go?
Well, we're just going to segue a little bit. So I'm going to say something about Texas noir in a moment, but I do also want to say I was incredibly lucky to, during stay at home, to be teaching a course called Novels and History. And there were wonderful moments to it, but one book that really blew me away in the course of teaching it is a novel called Homegoing by Ya Gyasi. And it's just this utterly brilliant piece of literature tracing two different lines of a family or descent from one African woman. One line that stays in Africa, one that comes to America as a result of the European slave trade. Beautifully done, Homegoing. So I did want to throw that in, a good shout out to it. But I've always been intrigued by very serious Marxists like Charlie Post being into mysteries. And a few people on the call will know that my Toronto-based friend Himani Banerjee and I will talk about mystery novels forever. And we trade them back and forth and so on. My own view is that it does say something about capitalism as a social form of life. And I once did a series of lectures on Marxist capital. I did 3 lectures called The Dialectical Detective, in which I essentially argued that for all kinds of people who are intimidated by what they think is economics, if you try to read capital as a mystery story, you get so much of what's going on. And of course, like every mystery story, there's violence and murder that's taking place in it. So I think that explains a lot about our attraction in terms of television viewing in this genre. I have watched both the most recent seasons of Babylon Berlin, which is absolutely creepy and haunting because, of course, you know that you're transitioning from Weimar Germany to the rise of the Nazis, and that's clearly depicted, and Ozark, which basically reworks the whole genre of capitalism and crime, and capitalism as a crime story. But the plug I'm going to put in terms of Texas noir, because many of you know I've moved to Houston, Texas, and I'm always struck. I thought only Canadians had silly stereotypes about Texas, but I've quickly learned that no, they're very, very widespread. And so I'm going to plug a Houston-born and bred mystery writer named Attica Locke. And Attica Locke has a series of novels. 2 of them are based in Houston. She, by the way, is now in LA. She's doing script writing as well as her novel writing. But most recently, her last 2 novels, the first one of which is called Bluebird, Bluebird, are based in East Texas. And essentially what she does is reveal another Texas. The most recent one, called Heaven My Home, is full of the indigenous history of Texas, of the African American history of the place. And running all through it are the traumas of race and class. These last 2, Bluebird, Bluebird, and Heaven My Home, the central character is an African American Texas Ranger. So once you square all of those circles, you quickly discover that this is someone who is dealing with all of the traumas of race and class, in this case, worked out as part of not just US history, but specifically Texas history. So I want to put a plug in, because for all of you both attracted to the thriller, the noir, and mystery as a genre, Attica Locke is one of the really up-and-coming writers in the genre, but also because it really disabuses people of many of the stereotypical conceptions of what Texas is and what it looks like. Now, one of my co-editors who is completely free of those stereotypes is Kate Doyle Griffiths. Kate has her own Texas history, and I also want to say, by way of segueing over to Kate, that Texas and Houston have phenomenal music scenes, and Kate herself comes out of some of that. So Kate, over to you.
Well, I hope all of that is true in terms of my perspective, and also coming out of a music scene. I actually don't think of myself really as a musician, but that's not because I don't like playing music, or not because I haven't studied music, but just because my experience of growing up in Houston, Texas was one of being surrounded by really, truly phenomenal musicians who were just so much better than me that, it sort of made me feel like what I was doing was a hobby. And sort of, I guess most famously that included Beyonce that she went to high school with me at the High School for the Performing and Visual Arts. And when I was thinking about what David was going to talk about in terms of both mysteries actually and music, that really resonated with me, and especially about the kind of not just Texas, but the connection between Texas and Louisiana right there on the border of either side of the state. And I actually, it can sort of spread into the stereotypes about the Gulf Coast, to sort of think of it as mysterious, but it is actually truly mysterious. And I was making fun of David for being new there, but the truth of the matter is that no matter how long you live there, and no matter how many generations back your family goes, there's always some kind of deep mystery involved that people are sort of spend their lives sorting out. And so I sort of always thought it was funny that Beyonce, this is like a calling card for me. It's like when I start a class, I do like 2 truths and a lie. And I went to high school with Beyonce as one of my truths and a lie. And students always think that's the lie, because like, how the fuck can that possibly be true? But that's one of the truths. And of course, being the Marxist that I am, actually all the things that I put up are kind of half true and half lies. Because I sometimes say I was friends with Beyonce, which is not true. Or that I speak Zulu, which is not exactly true. Although I certainly have tried to learn, or that I play the harp, which again is not exactly true, because I played the harp for a very long time, but I don't play now. So that's sort of how I end it and say, anthropology is supposed to be about figuring out kind of what's true and what's not true from people's direct experiences and so forth. But it always struck me as a kind of mysterious connection, or a mysterious repetition that, sorry, my daughter's talking to me, mysterious repetition that I went to high school with Beyonce. My parents both went to high school at Thomas Jefferson High School in Port Arthur, Texas. And one of its famous graduates actually was Janis Joplin. And so they always kind of bragged about that as young people when they left and went to school in Ohio. And, just like Charlie was talking about the connection between left politics and social democracy and mysteries, it's probably less known that Janis Joplin's family was sort of deeply embedded in a kind of communist and artistic scene in Port Arthur, Texas in the 1950s, a kind of bohemian left multiracial working class little scene. And so I was thinking about that in terms of Beyonce and music in Houston as well, because, you know, I don't know how many people here are actually fans of Beyonce, and she certainly gets a lot of flack, right, from those of us who are to the left, in the left of the feminist, you know, the left-wing people in the feminist movement, right, those of us who are socialist feminists, for kind of like representing often this like full-on boss feminism, right? Think about her, you know, this image of her in front of feminism, right? You know, behind her back, and really often bragging about being a boss, right? Although she's not the only one to do that, and actually I don't think the most extreme version of that, but she is certainly one of the most actual boss versions of that, in the sense of being quite wealthy, in the sense of having lots of people in her employ, and really in terms of her artistic endeavors, her work is really a group product, right, of many artists, many of whom are not, you know, their names are not in the headlights, right? But none of her work would actually be possible without this like intense collaboration between a lot of different kinds of artists, but a lot of whom are from the Gulf Coast as well, right? So, but I don't think that's the only way to think about what Beyonce's work is like. Her sort of most artistically, you know, deep piece, I think, is Lemonade. And I was reading the reviews of Lemonade from when it came out earlier today to sort of think about what people had to say about it. And Billboard actually posted when it came out that Lemonade was a work of revolutionary Black feminism, which I thought was a pretty intense assertion, right? To imagine that this kind of hyper pop, hyper capitalist pop star, right, was a revolutionary Black feminist. You know, it's a pretty questionable assertion. But I also love the video. I don't know if you've ever watched it all the way through, but it has like some really amazing parts, and parts that she really goes much more deeply attached, right, to her kind of Louisiana roots and her East Texas roots in that piece than she does in almost any other one, including, I think, this kind of embrace of like rage and violence that doesn't appear in the rest of her work as itself an assertion of feminism and of womanhood. But I think there's something to it, actually, which is if you look at sort of who the fans, like what kind of fans rallied around Beyonce during that point, and for what reason, what people really took from it was less this kind of boss feminism, right? If you go and read comments about it, or you really also, for me, talking to students, right? I had one student, the first time I ever did this kind of like Beyonce shit at the beginning of my class, I had one student who actually called herself Beyonce and asked, because I always also ask my students what name they would like to be called regardless of what their legal name is. And I had this particular student who asked to be called Beyonce. And I asked her why she wanted me to call her Beyonce. And her answer was actually because she was so inspired by Lemonade to assert herself as a Black woman, and particularly by the scene of Beyonce dancing on top of the police cars that are surrounded by water, right? Which really is evoking the hurricane and Hurricane Katrina, but also the hurricanes that have hit Houston that have gotten kind of lesser play. And I think that really does complicate, right, this idea of, oh, we can select this one kind of boss feminist, the most, you know, one of the most kind of high grossing pop artists in the world. We can just purely assign that work to boss feminism. I don't think we can, because the work itself, right, is produced by hundreds of artists, and it's the collective product of many people's work. And, you know, I've talked to people in Houston and people who've even participated in in Beyonce's videos, but also in her extremely intensely produced kind of pop shows. And if people who know can pick out the pieces that are actually, you know, taken from this artist and this artist and this artist, in a certain way, that's like appropriation and assertion of power. In another way, in a Marxist sense, right, that's also the collective product of a whole group of people and their work.
Hey,
And
we've got a bunch of questions that have come in. I want to make sure we have time for people to field them. So
okay, I'm not trying to run on too much, but I also wanted to say that the same is true of this idea of Beyonce somehow embodying or representing revolutionary Black feminism, right? That to the extent that she does that or doesn't, it's really partially also about what her fans do or don't do with that. You know, and when my student told me that about kind of dancing on the police cars, what it made me think of was here in Flatbush, you know, Juve is a really important holiday, this kind of, and it is also a quite mysterious holiday and reminds me a lot of the kind of Afro-Caribbean, Pan-African, you know, global African culture that is quite prominent on the East Coast. But one day I was walking to work very early on Juve while it was still happening, and I happened to come across actually precisely this kind of like Bakhtinian reversal of young teenage like Caribbean and African American people dancing on top of a fucking police car that they had painted, you know, with all kinds of blue and pink and purple paint, and the cop was just standing there doing nothing, because that's what Juve's all about. And if that's what people are taking from Beyonce, I'm all for it. But I also wanted to throw in that there's a lot of really other great, wonderful artists that have come out of the quite small group of people that went to HSPBA with Beyonce. And, you know, I guess I'll just wrap up by drawing your attention to some of those. One of them is Robert Glasper, who's a 9 Grammy award-winning jazz pianist, but who similarly, I think, you know, I thought about his work when I was thinking about what I wanted Spectre to be, which sounds kind of like a weird thing to say. But if you read how he talks about jazz, one of the kinds of ideas he's inspired by is that is a kind of universalist vision of what jazz is, and a Black universalist vision of what jazz is, that hip hop is jazz, that bebop is jazz, that pretty much all kinds of creative musical products that are considered Black music, but also American music, really have their roots in that kind of modern proletarian African universalist tradition. And it's that kind of expansive, that ability to expand a definition through the lived experience of the people participating in it, that I want Spectre to be like, and that I like try to think about when I'm thinking about art and culture. So that I wanted to draw your attention to him, and like I definitely recommend listening to him. And the other one I wanted you guys to think about is a small art studio, and just like Glasper, although I think they might not get along. So again, contradictions and tension. But there's something called Studio Inertia that was founded by another graduate of HSPVA, Lisa Harris. And she was trained as an opera singer. She was actually, people always ask me, was Beyonce the best singer at your school? Hell no, Beyonce was not the best singer at our school. She wasn't even the best pop singer at our school. But the actual best singer at our school, in my opinion, was Lisa Harris. And she has founded this art studio. She now makes all kinds of music. She brings in all kinds of guests to do it, but it's actually a multimedia art studio. She also makes film and visual art, and she does it in the context of Third Ward in Houston, which is both where close to where David works at University of Houston, but also was one of the original freedmen's towns that was in and around Houston, Texas. And just to say, Glasper also argues the same thing, right? That jazz is not just music, right? It's this whole array of cultural products and even politics. So
there are lots of questions.
Yeah. So anyway, I'll just leave it there, and we can get into the questions. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Kate. We have time for a few questions that have come in. So if I'll just read them, and if editors want to just jump in and give pithy responses, as I want to get through, we have about 4 questions. So if a couple of people want to chime in response to each of them. The first question is from Karen. Given that we're in a dark moment, what new theorizing and organizing do editors find most promising? Go ahead, Charlie.
The fact that in the midst of almost 15% unemployment, international hysteria about the pandemic, etc., workers around this country, are taking strike action is, for me, the most inspiring thing that's happening in the last few weeks. Ashley and I carried out an interview with Kim Moody about 2 months ago about COVID, the crisis, etc. And when we asked him to think about what sectors of the working class had some social power in this period, his initial response was, "Oh, I could name it, but the thing is, if they try to exercise it, people want to hang them." But instead, when workers have taken job actions, they've been seen widely as heroes. And that's what's encouraging me.
Yeah, I would, if is it okay if I pop in?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would say the exact same. I mean, it is a dark time. There aren't many reasons for hope, but there's the same reason for hope that there's always been, which is the self-activity of the working class. I mean, this is why I'm a communist, right? It's because it is dark. I don't think we have any other hope. There's no other way around it. We're not going to vote ourselves out of this problem in November. We're not going to find the right geniuses to give us the technical interventions that are going to solve it for us. There's only one hope, and that is the combativeness and self-activity of the people that make society run. And so, given that that is the analysis that I have of society, that means it's a good thing when when the working class is in fact active and protesting and flexing its muscles. And that, plus the fact that with all of this pressure, all this kind of ideological pressure coming from the top, coming from politicians and from the leaders of big business saying we have to reopen, we have to accept debts, that the most important thing is Wall Street. The fact that we still see, I think the latest numbers are, still the case that about 75% of Americans who are polled say no, right? Say no. And there's no like ideological reason for them to say that 80% cuts across left and right. It cuts across all kinds of different divisions. But it's just the drive to self-preservation of people who do not want to go and sacrifice themselves for capital. And as Charlie said, we see people not just having those ideas but acting on them. So that's the thing. I mean, things like the work that we've been doing, and especially with TV's leadership on the Dispatches series, every time I read through those and edit those, I am restored. It gives me a lot of fire. So that's where I look. That's what gives me hope. That's the one thing. It's always been the only thing.
And I always wanted to add one thing to just to emphasize that, Vanessa said the self-activity of the working class. I think one thing that we're seeing here that's really inspiring, to me at least, is an almost, I don't want to say unprecedented because it's not, but unprecedented in my lifetime, the number of wildcats cascading across the country. And so, and in unexpected places. We might see these typically gathered in Union states, or I should say, I live in Greensboro, North Carolina, and about a week ago, bus drivers walked off the job, non-unionized. I'm from Richmond, Virginia, same thing, 2 weeks ago. So you see these wildcats cascading, and it's not, of course, union leaderships that are calling for these strikes, but it really is self-activity of workers. It's happening, I don't want to say purely spontaneously, but it's happening in this way that I think, when we start to reflect on what this crisis has, the kind of language that this crisis has brought into politics, when we use these weird words like essential workers, as if all workers aren't essential, I think it's really starting to open up some of the contradictions for workers themselves. It's not, it doesn't even have to be filtered through some theoretical lens or narrated to workers. It's this almost, it's almost so obvious to them. So this kind of self-activity for me has been really inspiring.
I want to just get in a couple more. I don't know if they're related questions, but Bill asked two questions, and I do think they're strangely related. First, he asked, how do you think about imperialism? Are you planning to bring in writers from outside the US? And he also asked, are people reading pandemic fiction?
So we already have authors from outside the US, and we're always looking to expand that. I mean, yeah, I guess those are very related. I mean, I teach a grad course called Philosophy of Fascism and Anti-Fascism, and one of the things that we read is Lenin's Imperialism, and there's no I got radicalized doing anti-war work in the early 2000s, and I just learned the lesson right away that there is no consistent socialist politics that isn't anti-imperialist. And imperialism, both as a military strategy, a strategy of capital, and as an ideology, has such a stranglehold on people's imaginations. Even just pointing out, back doing that anti-war work and talking to people and saying, well, like Iraqis do not want the United States to invade their country, and having people stare back at me, blinking, uncomprehending about how that could possibly matter. And that's, those aren't like diehard Bush supporters. Those are just good liberals, right? So imperialism and having a very consistent anti-imperialist politics, I think, is absolutely essential, or else we're not going to get anywhere. We see it now, where the response of the people who are leading our society, we are demanding unemployment benefits and paid sick leave and universal health care. And they're giving us racism and anti-China hysteria. That's what they want to feed us. I recently wrote a piece where the title of the piece, I quote a line from Martin Luther King, who's talking about white supremacy in the United States and how elite whites gave poor whites Jim Crow to eat, right? He says, and they ate Jim Crow, right? That's what they're trying to pull with us now. They're trying to get us to eat xenophobia, which of course we can't, right? And so yeah, it's absolutely, I think, at the heart, right, of socialism, or else we lose. Period.
Tithi, and then somebody should address pandemic fiction. You're muted, Tithi.
Sorry. Just to add to what Vanessa said, which obviously we all agree with, that two very specific things that I've been working on that's going to be up on the website soon. One is an interview with a leading feminist from India, Kavita Krishnan, and one of the things that we're trying to explore together is what role caste plays in the pandemic, because caste, as you know, the way it unfurls in India is a system of oppression based on touch. So you're not supposed to touch the lower caste. The lower caste cannot touch your eating utensils or the Brahmin cannot walk in the shadow of the lower caste. So even his shadow cannot touch the Brahmin, right? So that sort of, so what does that mean in a pandemic, which is about touching, right? So does it escalate caste hierarchies in the Indian context? So that's one of the things we're exploring. And the second thing that I'm translating right now is for the dispatches. It is an interview with domestic workers in Bengal and garment workers who work in sweatshop conditions in Dhaka, Bangladesh. So both of those will be up in Spectre soon, just to give you a sense that we're trying very hard not to have simply US-centric workers' perspectives in the journal, but this is an appeal to all of you listening in, that if you do have such projects that you know of, please do collect us. Like, I would love to hear from the Latina organizer who was quoted in the New York Times about the meatpacking plant in Waterloo, Iowa, right? I actually tried to contact her and I haven't heard back, because it was an amazing story that the Times did. And I was thinking, wow, if we could get her to speak for Spectre, that would be brilliant. And so if you guys are in touch, do let us know, because we would love to center those voices and experiences. Just to go back quickly on the point of
move on to the conclude. So be quick if you can.
Yeah. So just to go back quickly on the workers' question, that what is the point of hope? I think a growing realization in the working class that society is actually held together by workers and not bosses. This is very clear in this pandemic, and it is our job to consolidate that consciousness.
Thanks so much, Tithi. Sorry to cut things off, but we did promise people we'd be done in 2 hours. So I'll just ask the final question, but we don't have time to address it. But I'll let it stew in people's minds, because I think it will provoke art, both for the provoke thought for the journal and for the website. What is the role of Marxist, in quotations, visual art in the journal? Is it limited to illustration? And I think we can quickly say no, but we want Marxist illustrators and Marxist thinking about illustration and artistic production, and we'll welcome that in the print journal and on the website. So I'll just turn it over to Vanessa and then Zach for concluding comments. Take it away, Vanessa.
Actually, Zach, do you want to? I feel like I've been talking a lot, so Zach, if you want to.
Sure, I'm happy to. Well, I just wanted to thank everyone for tuning in this evening, and really to thank you all for all the love that you've shown to Spectre. You know, as a number of people said, it really wasn't easy launching when we did, and really we couldn't imagine a worse time in our lifetime to try to fundraise. But believe it or not, we're just about there. So in a matter of 2 months, we've raised almost $65,000, gotten over 600 subscribers to the print edition. I think about 650 at this point, and we couldn't have done it without all of your support. So before we close, I just wanted to make a final plea for subscribers. And of course, if you're here, you're already subscribed. But if we can raise just $10,000 more over the next few weeks, not only are we going to sell out the entire print run of the first issue, but we're actually going to be sustainable in the long run and be here for quite a while. So I know
Tell your friends.
Yeah, so tell all your friends. I know it seems like a lot of money. But it really adds up. And I should say, none of us on the editorial board are actually taking a penny. Almost all the money goes to covering our operational costs. So, you know, I wanted to be corny and paraphrase from the German ideology. Since we're dealing with the publishers who are devoid of premises, we must begin by stating that the first premise of all journals' existence, and therefore of all history, is the premise, namely, that all journals must be in a position to survive in order to be able to make history. So it's for that reason, and that reason alone, that we're out here begging. You know,
Yes.
You know, certainly we're the ones doing the work behind the scenes, but without all of you, none of this would be possible or even desirable. And, you know, we didn't launch Spectre for vanity's sake. We're doing this because we feel that there isn't really a popular venue out there publishing from a class struggle perspective. And we really want to fill that void, and that's really where you come in. You know, we don't want a passive audience here at Spectre. We want an engaged base. We want readers who contribute regularly to our website, to our print edition. If you haven't seen it, you can always send an email to inbox@spectrejournal.com. Remember, spelled Spectre the British way. But send an email if you want to pitch a piece. We run stuff every week on the website, a couple times a week. We're taking submissions for the print journal. We want people who use what we publish to initiate debates, launch reading groups in your cities. We want you to force us to step it up if we ever slip. Not that I hope we will, but that's why this project, I think, is so important to all of us. And with one last push, we're going to be here for the foreseeable future. So now that you see what we're about, you've hopefully seen the print edition, or if it hasn't arrived yet, you've seen what we've been publishing on the website. We mean business, or I guess we hate business, but we mean class war. So please tell all your friends, your families, comrades, even your enemies, subscribe to Spectre. And we really promise you won't regret it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I co-sign all of that. And I'll, just like on a cheesy note, I'll just add that, I feel like I joined this project looking to create a journal and didn't realize that I would be helping to create a community and creating community around myself, like both the editorial board. I've made new friends, new comrades, and all, but more, even like more kind of in terms of greater impact, the writers that I've had the opportunity to interact with, reading things that may not have come across my desk otherwise if I didn't happen to be co-editing a journal. And so that's the thing that I think is very exciting to me, that this isn't just us back here kind of creating a product, that we are, actually producing something that is the basis for these human connections that are going to create the kinds of infrastructure that can help spawn all kinds of new movements and trends and practical interventions.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. I want to again thank everybody who joined us tonight for Spectre Presents Meet the Editors. We hope that we've given you a sense of the project that we're involved in, and we really encourage people to write, donate, and get all your friends to subscribe to Spectre, because if we can sell out of the first issue, we are on track to continuing to make this a living project that can be a part of the new socialist movement in the US and internationally. So thank you for joining us tonight. Be safe, be healthy, build the class struggle. Bye, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.